October 17, 1888. The air in the high desert had begun to carry a new edge, a crystalline sharpness that spoke of the season's turn. At 5,400 feet, at the granite feet of the Dragoon Mountains, the sun's warmth was a fleeting gift, withdrawn each afternoon with a swift, dramatic plunge of temperature. The woman, Anna, felt it in her bones, a deep, resonant ache that was more than just the cold. She was 22 years old. For 67 days, she had been alone, save for the dog. Bo, a rangy German shepherd with intelligent, amber eyes and fur the color of dried wheat, sat on his haunches near the mouth of the shallow cave, his head cocked, listening to the vast, empty silence of the landscape. The cave was less a cavern and more a deep scoop in the rock, a 30-foot-wide alcove that offered protection from the wind but little else. It faced northeast, a poor orientation that denied them the grace of the morning sun. By noon, it was cast in a deep, chilling shadow that would not lift until the following day. Her possessions were few, a testament to the abruptness of her new reality. A bedroll, 2 wool blankets, a cast-iron skillet, a dented tin pot, a water canteen, and a small canvas sack containing what was left of the flour, salt, and dried beans. She had a geology hammer, its head chipped from overuse, and a sharpened length of steel salvaged from the splintered axle of the wagon. That was all. Everything else had been lost. The fire pit, a ring of carefully chosen stones, was the center of their small world. Each piece of firewood had been gathered with immense effort, scavenged from the sparse, skeletal remains of juniper and mesquite that clung to life in the rocky soil. She rationed it with a miser's discipline. A small fire for cooking in the evening, its embers carefully banked and buried in ash to be coaxed back to life in the frigid dawn. She knew, with the chilling certainty of mathematical fact, that it was not enough. The wood she could gather within a day's walk would not last the winter. The cave was too exposed. The cold was a patient predator, and it was coming for them. The decision was born not of inspiration, but of grim necessity. The interior of the cave was a chaotic jumble of their meager life. Tools, food supplies, and firewood lay in disorganized piles on the uneven rock floor, vulnerable to moisture and the small, scuttling creatures of the night. She needed order. She needed efficiency. She needed shelves. For 3 days, she studied the back wall of the alcove, running her hands over its surface, tapping it with the hammer, listening. Most of it was solid granite, an impassive, unyielding mass that would shatter her tools and her resolve. But near the southern corner, about 4 feet up from the floor, was a different kind of rock. A vertical seam of reddish-brown conglomerate, perhaps 2 feet wide, ran from floor to ceiling. It was a composite of smaller stones and pebbles cemented together in a softer, sandier matrix. It was a weakness. A place to begin. On the morning of October 21st, she started. The work was brutal, a slow and punishing assault on the stone. She used the sharpened steel as a chisel, holding it steady with one hand and striking it with the hammer in a steady, rhythmic cadence. Chip. 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 The sound was small, swallowed by the immense scale of the canyon. Each blow sent a jarring shock up her arm, a vibration that resonated deep in her shoulder. Dust, fine as flour, filled the air, coating her face and hair, catching in her throat. Bo lay by the cave entrance, his nose resting on his paws, watching her with an unnerving stillness, his ears twitching at every strike. The progress was agonizingly slow. By the end of the first day, she had managed to carve out a shallow indentation no bigger than her hand. Her palm was blistered, her back a knot of screaming muscle. But it was a start. A mark of intention upon the indifferent stone. She worked through the next day, and the next, her movements becoming more economical, her body adapting to the rhythm of the labor. She learned to read the rock, to find the path of least resistance, to exploit the tiny fissures and inconsistencies in the conglomerate. The shallow dent deepened, slowly taking the shape of a rough rectangle. It was a fight for inches, a battle waged against geological time. By the first week of November, the routine was deeply ingrained. Rise before dawn, rekindle the fire, eat a small portion of reconstituted beans, and then begin the day's labor. The air was colder now, the overnight temperatures dropping below freezing. A thin skim of ice formed on the water in the canteen each morning. She worked until her arms trembled with fatigue, pausing only to gather more wood or to check the simple snare lines she had set for rabbits. The shelf was now 6 inches deep and nearly 2 feet long. It was a crude thing, but it was functional. She could already envision her sack of flour resting upon it, safe and dry. Beau's behavior had become peculiar. He would often stop his sentry duty at the cave mouth, walk to the back wall where she worked, and press his ear against the stone, a low growl rumbling in his chest. He would sniff at the dust, his brow furrowed. She assumed he was reacting to the vibrations, the unfamiliar sound of her work echoing within the rock. She would murmur to him, a soft reassurance, and he would reluctantly return to his post. On November 9th, something changed. The sound. For weeks, the impact of the hammer on the chisel had produced a solid, dull thud. A sound of dense, unyielding matter. But that afternoon, the sound shifted. It became a thump. A hollow resonance that seemed to travel away from the point of impact, absorbed by something other than solid rock. She stopped, her arm frozen mid-swing. She tapped the back of the nascent shelf again, gently this time. Thump. It was unmistakable. A pocket. An air gap. Her heart began to beat a little faster. She set down the hammer and pressed her ear to the stone, mirroring the dog. Silence. She picked up her tools and began to work with a new urgency, focusing her blows on the center of the hollow-sounding area. The rock began to crumble more easily. An hour later, her chisel punched through. A spray of dust and small pebbles fell away into darkness. A crack, thin as a knife blade, appeared. A draft of air, colder than the cave air and utterly still, whispered out, carrying a scent she couldn't place. It was the smell of absolute dryness, of enclosed space, of time itself. It did not smell like a natural cavern. It smelled made. She worked feverishly, her fatigue forgotten, her movements fueled by a strange mixture of hope and trepidation. She widened the crack, chipping away at its edges, pulling out loose stones with her bare fingers. The hole grew from the size of a coin to the size of her fist. The draft of cold, stale air was stronger now. Beau stood directly behind her, whining softly, his body tense. He would not approach the opening. She needed to see. The sun was setting, and the interior of the cave was already sinking into a deep gloom. She lit one of her carefully hoarded tallow lamps, the small flame sputtering to life, casting long, dancing shadows against the rock walls. With a trembling hand, she pushed the lamp through the opening. The light wavered, then steadied. And she saw. It was not a cave. It was a room. The beam of the lamp illuminated a surface of dressed stone, blocks cut and fitted with a precision that was breathtaking. The wall was smooth, vertical, meeting a floor of leveled flagstones at a perfect right angle. The space was small, but it was undeniably the work of human hands. There was no dust, no debris, only the clean lines of careful construction. She held the lamp there for a long time, moving it back and forth, trying to make sense of what she was seeing. A finished room, sealed inside a mountain. Who would do such a thing? And why? The sheer, silent intentionality of it was overwhelming. It felt less like a discovery and more like a violation, a trespass into a place that had been deliberately forgotten. That night, she did not sleep. She sat huddled in her blankets, the small fire her only comfort, her eyes fixed on the dark, ragged hole in the wall. The wind howled outside the cave, a mournful, lonely sound. But from the hole, there was only a profound and absolute silence. It was the silence of a place that had been waiting. Beau lay beside her, pressed tight against her leg, his head on her lap. He, too, stared at the darkness behind the rock, as if he could see the history sealed within it. The following morning, under the flat, grey light of a clouded sky, she made the opening larger. She worked methodically, her initial frenzy replaced by a deliberate, careful focus. She was no longer just carving a shelf, she was performing an archaeological excavation. She removed stone after stone, placing them in a neat pile beside her, until the hole was wide enough for her to squeeze through. She hesitated for a moment at the threshold, the stale air washing over her face. Then, taking a deep breath, she slid through the opening, feet first, dropping the short distance to the stone floor inside. She stood up and brushed the dust from her clothes. She had brought the lamp with her. In its flickering light, the room revealed itself. It was small, no more than 10 feet by 10 feet. The ceiling was low, just high enough for her to stand upright. The walls were the same dressed stone she had seen from the outside, the seams between the blocks so tight she could not fit a fingernail between them. It was a marvel of patient craftsmanship. Against the far wall stood a simple, three-legged stool and a small, sturdy table. Both were made of dark, aged wood, their design functional and unadorned. On the table sat a single object, a leather-bound book. She approached it slowly, her footsteps echoing slightly in the enclosed space. She ran a finger over the cover. It was cool and dry. There was no film of dust on its surface, a fact that seemed deeply strange. The air in the room was so still, so devoid of circulation, that dust had simply never settled. It was as if the room had been sealed yesterday. But she knew, from the smell, from the feel of the place, that it had been sealed for a very, very long time. She did not open the book. Not yet. First, she needed to understand the space itself. She examined the joinery of the table, the way the legs were fitted into the top without a single nail. She studied the walls, looking for any other openings, any sign of a door or window. There were none. This room was a vault. A self-contained cell, built from the inside out and then, somehow, sealed. After a complete circuit of the small room, her curiosity finally overcame her restraint. She returned to the table and picked up the book. It was heavier than it looked. The leather was worn smooth at the corners. She opened it to the first page. The paper was thick, high-quality rag paper, and it was filled with a neat, compact script, written in black ink. It was not a diary, filled with thoughts and feelings. It was a log. A builder's record. The first entry was dated August 4, 1879, 9 years ago. Her breath caught in her throat. The entry was short, precise, almost clinical. Wall thickness at west face now 14 inches. Sandstone seam holding. Mortar mix remained stable at 3 parts sand, 1 part lime. She turned the page. More entries, each dated, each detailing a stage of construction. August 12, 1879. Began dressing stone for the north wall. The granite is hard but consistent. Progress is 1 block per day. September 2, 1879. Floor leveled. Laid the first course of flagstones. The level is true. She read on, mesmerized. The writer, who signed his entries with a simple, blocky F. Bauer, was a man of immense patience and skill. He documented everything, the dimensions of the stones, the composition of the mortar, the daily temperature inside the excavation. He was building this space for himself, a solitary and monumental undertaking. He wrote of the rock as if it were a living thing, an adversary to be understood and respected. The mountain gives up its stone reluctantly, one entry read. Anna felt a strange kinship with this unseen man. She, too, was in a battle with the stone, albeit on a much smaller, more desperate scale. He had been quarrying and building, she had been chipping and scraping. But the fundamental struggle was the same. The log detailed the construction of this first room, which he called the antechamber, over a period of 4 months. The final entry for this phase simply stated, October 28, 1879. Antechamber complete. Ready to begin the main passage. There was more. She looked around the antechamber, her eyes searching for what she had missed. In the south wall, the one directly opposite her entry point, she saw it. A section of the wall where the mortar lines were almost invisible. It looked like a solid piece of stone, but on closer inspection, she could see the faint outline of a perfectly fitted door, set flush with the surrounding blocks. There was no handle, no knob, no visible hinge. She pushed against it. It didn't move. She ran her hands over its surface, feeling for a latch or a seam. Near the bottom, her fingers found a small, almost imperceptible indentation. She pressed it. With a low grinding sound, a section of the stone pivoted inward. The engineering was ingenious. A precisely counterweighted stone door, balanced to open with minimal effort. Beyond it lay a narrow, dark passage, just wide enough for one person to walk through. It extended about 15 feet into the mountain before turning sharply to the right. The air that flowed out was just as cold and still as in the first room. Holding the lamp high, she stepped through the doorway and into the passage. The walls here were rougher, the natural rock of the mountain, but the floor was still perfectly level. She followed it to the corner and turned. The passage opened up into a much larger space. This was the main living chamber. It was breathtaking. Perhaps 20 feet square, with a high, vaulted ceiling that followed the natural arch of an excavated dome. In the center of the far wall was a massive stone hearth, its mantel a single, enormous slab of granite. A flue, expertly carved, rose from it and disappeared into the darkness above. To the left of the hearth, a bed frame was built directly into an alcove in the wall, the mattress ticking still clean, a heavy wool blanket folded neatly at its foot. To the right, a set of deep shelves, the very thing she had been trying to build for herself, were carved directly out of the rock face. On them sat 2 tin plates, a cup, a small stack of books, and a collection of geological specimens, quartz crystals, chunks of mica, a polished piece of turquoise, arranged in a careful, deliberate display. This wasn't just a room. It was a home. A sanctuary, built with loving, monastic devotion. And it was utterly, profoundly empty. The silence in this larger room was different. It was heavier. It was the silence of a life abruptly paused. She placed her lamp on a stone ledge and walked deeper into the room. She ran her hand over the folded blanket on the bed. The wool was coarse but clean. She looked up the chimney flue. It was dark, but she could feel a faint draft, smelling of pine and cold stone. The design was perfect. This was a place meant to be lived in. A fortress of solitude, designed for warmth and safety. She returned to the antechamber to retrieve Bauer's journal, bringing it back into the main room and sitting on the edge of the bed. She turned the pages, skipping past the construction details, looking for something more personal, for some clue as to the man who had built this impossible place. The entries continued in their factual, detached tone, documenting the excavation of the main chamber, the carving of the hearth, the construction of the furniture. But then, the nature of the entries began to change. They became less frequent, the gaps between dates growing from a day or two to a week or more. The subject shifted from construction to observation. October 15, 1879. First snow on the high peaks. The cistern is full. The winter will be long. October 22, 1879. Tracked a mountain lion up to the ridgeline. A large male. He knows I am here. We watch each other. He was a keen observer of his environment, a man in tune with the rhythms of the wild. But there was no mention of other people, of a past life, of why he was here. Then she came to the final pages. The handwriting was slightly less steady. The entries were shorter, more stark. November 1, 1879. Water level in the cistern is low. No rain for 68 days, an entry a week later. November 8, 1879. The sound is back. Deeper this time. From the east. That was the last entry. The rest of the page was blank. The next page was blank. The entire rest of the book was empty. It had been left open to this page, as if he had been interrupted in the middle of writing, or had intended to write more and never returned. A cold dread settled in Anna's stomach. The sound. What sound? She looked towards the east wall of the chamber. It was solid rock, just like the others. There was nothing there. Nothing but the immense, silent weight of the mountain. The decision was simple. She could not go back. The shallow, cold alcove outside was a death trap. This place, this strange, silent home, was life. It was warmth. It was shelter. It was the answer to a prayer she had been too weary to utter. She began the process of moving her life through the small hole in the wall. It was a slow, awkward task. She passed her bedroll, her blankets, her cooking pot and skillet through the opening. She brought the sack of flour and beans, her precious, dwindling supply of food. Finally, she coaxed Bo through. He was hesitant, sniffing at the strange air, his ears flat against his head. But he trusted her. He scrambled through the hole and landed softly on the stone floor, shaking the dust from his coat. Once inside, he began a thorough, silent inspection of the chamber, his nose to the ground, his tail held low. Anna's first act was one of continuation. She took her flint and steel and laid a fire in the great stone hearth, using a handful of the dried juniper she had brought with her. She had worried about the flue, whether it would draw properly after so many years of disuse. But as the kindling caught and the flames grew, a steady, perfect draft pulled the smoke up and away. A deep, radiant warmth began to fill the stone room, a warmth that felt ancient and profound. It pushed back not only the physical cold, but the cold of fear and uncertainty that had been her constant companion for months. You have to understand what this warmth meant. It was not just the simple comfort of heat. It was security. It was the tangible end of a long and desperate vulnerability. It was the feeling of a door closing on the past and a new one opening on a possible future. Later, while sweeping the floor with a makeshift broom, she discovered a low, flat crate tucked away under the bed frame. It was heavy. Prying it open with her steel chisel, she found it packed with tools. Saws, hammers, a brace and bit, levels, and a complete set of high-quality chisels, all coated in a thin layer of protective grease. They were tools of a master craftsman, far superior to her own pitiful, broken implements. It was a legacy. An inheritance from a ghost. The winter came. Snow blanketed the mountains, sealing the high passes, burying the world in a deep, silent white. But inside the mountain, Anna was safe. She was warm. She and Bo lived in the quiet rhythm of their new home. She spent her days exploring the space, learning its secrets. She used Bauer's tools to build a proper door for the opening she had made, insulating her world from the harshness outside. She read the books he had left behind, treatises on geology, manuals on engineering, and volumes of Stoic philosophy. She came to know him through the things he had built and the words he had valued. But the mystery of his disappearance was a constant, quiet presence. The last entry in his journal haunted her. The sound is back. Deeper this time. From the east as one afternoon, driven by a need to know, she took one of Bauer's heavier hammers and began tapping along the east wall, the direction he had indicated. Much of it gave a solid, dead ring. But near the back corner, in a section of darker, more crystalline granite, the sound changed. It was a dull, resonant boom, as if there were a void beyond. It was the same hollow sound she had heard in her own cave, but on a much larger scale. Lying on the floor near that spot was a single, heavy-headed pickaxe. Its wooden handle was smooth from use, but the steel tip was fractured, a piece of it sheared clean off. It lay beside a series of deep gouges in the stone wall. He had been digging. He had been trying to break through, just as she had. But he had been trying to get further in, not out. What had he been chasing? Or what had been chasing him? She stood there for a long time, her hand resting on the cold stone, feeling the faint vibration of her own heartbeat echo back at her. She could continue his work. She could take up the pickaxe and try to find out what lay beyond that wall, what sound had called to him, what mystery he had died trying to solve. She had the tools. She had the time. But as she looked around the warm, firelit room, at her dog sleeping peacefully on the hearth, at the life she had found within these walls, she made a choice. She picked up the broken pickaxe and placed it carefully on the mantelpiece, a memorial to the man who had given her this sanctuary. His mystery would remain his own. She would not disturb his final work. Her work was different. Her work was to live. I have visited this place. I have stood in that room and felt the perfect silence that F. Bauer built. I have touched the gouges in the east wall. Anna lived there for another 53 years, a quiet, solitary life, leaving her own marks on the land, her own story to be pieced together by those who came after. Two solitary people, a man and a woman, separated by a decade but joined by the same stone, the same silence, the same unyielding will to endure. They never met, but in that space, they created a conversation that continues to this day. A testament, carved in rock, to the quiet resilience of the human heart. If you listen closely, in places like this, you can still hear the echoes.